Thanks for coming back to engage in a great discussion. Before we get going on to the next question for our panelists, Gary would like to say a few words.
Thank you, Chairman. Listening to the discussion this morning, I was struck by a number of common themes. One of them was communication. And Sarah, you raised the issue of people wanting to use social media and those kinds of things. And one of the main challenges that we have is this day and age, we're dealing with teaspoons and bullets, 140 character messages with abbreviations and emoticons that I can't understand because I'm having a heck of a time communicating with my daughter when she sends me messages all the time. But another concept that came across is basically communication. And some of the challenges that we face with communication is language. And very often when we try to communicate in these short messages, we use terms that mean different things to different people. From my introduction today, you know that I do a lot of work in fisheries. And one of the real buzzwords in fisheries is conservation, because it means a heck of a lot of different things to different people. But in fisheries, we've learned that conservation means my use before yours. And we're really talking about sort of transfers of the burden of responsibility. So those kinds of notions of conservation, I think, have some very serious implications. I also wanted to point out that with Jim, as an official of the Forest Service, where it's the people's land, the people's office, all good things for all good people. One of the problems that you have is that when you manage land and you manage the forest, you can't do what I call E cubed AT squared, which is everything to everybody, everywhere, all the time. That's an impossible situation to be put in. And Jim, when you talked about it's not really a game of 281, it's one. And one of the things I wanted you to think about a little bit was, recall that map I put out there in terms of islands of Indianness and IFMAT. And there's a different way of looking at that. Because IFMAT basically concerned over 200 reservations in 36 states. Those tribes have increasing political and economic influence. I also talked about partnerships. So think about partnerships. What kind of inter-tribal partnerships can we imagine? Can you imagine, for example, the tribes in those 36 states contacting their representatives, their senators, with a common message? I think that the chairman of the Budget Committee would be much more swayed by something like that than having Jim go up there and try to make the case as a single individual from the administration. So there are things that tribes can do in terms of effectuating the kinds of changes and getting the resources that are needed that federal officials can't. So let's give some thought to that and try to get back to some of the fundamental questions here that I think are going to help us move forward.
Thank you, Gary. Going to the second question. What are your administrative policy and legislative recommendations for addressing challenges?
I'll start because it looks like there's not as many people in the room right now in case I fumble all my words. But yeah, what are some of your administrative policy, legislative recommendations? I think the first thing I thought of when I saw this, I thought, do we really need more? Like, just to put that back out, do we really need more? Or is it that possibly we can improve or amend what we actually have in place to allow tribes to actually build their leadership and act as a formidable land management group? And another thought that came to mind is getting around NEPA, and so possibly amending NEFRMA so that we can extend tribal land boundary and actually allow them to manage those resources on a broader scale. So those are my quick thoughts.
Okay, well, from the Conservancy's perspective, we have a multi-pronged strategy to be able to address our work, but like was described earlier, you have to have discipline, you have to have focus. And in these times, the Nature Conservancy has focused in on, from a policy perspective, on the work that Jim is defining. The Wildfire Disaster Funding Act is our #1 priority. In fact, as we're sitting here right now, there are 45 state government relations directors of the Nature Conservancy on a strategy call, and they're doing this once a week to determine who they need to bring to the table to help focus in on the individuals that are necessary to get the bill passed the way we all desire it to be passed. So it's that discipline and the focus. Also, we do have aspirations. We want to make sure that the base budget is preserved. We want to make sure that the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program and those experiments continue to thrive and continue to grow. And if we could see a doubling of that program, it's ideal, beyond its authorization of $40 million. But at the same time, we recognize that Congress in many ways is both broke and broken, that there isn't enough money to meet all of our aspirations. And you sit down with any congressman and senator, they have a large shopping list. But as it relates to the unified issues that we're all here talking about, timber country across America, we need to think about a different paradigm of financing and funding. It is of great interest to the states to make sure that our nation's forests are managed well. And many of the conversations we are having with the state governments, particularly in the fire-prone forests of the nation. So we have honed in at the Nature Conservancy on conversations with the legislatures and the governors in those states to encourage a collaborative relationship and hopefully new funding streams to be able to enhance the capacity to get more work done on the ground. So specifically what I'm talking about, I'll give you an example. In the state of Oregon, the legislature at this moment is about to consider a $5 million appropriation to augment the federal funds coming in. Not a lot of money, but it's a start in a shift of thinking that it is not just the federal government's responsibility, but a mutual responsibility to be able to manage those lands. It's our belief at the same time that Congress should be giving incentives to states to come in and be collaborative partners. And I've talked to Jim, and Jim is using his $33 million of discretion this year to be able to match those states who are willing to behave as collaborative partners. But I think it also comes down to all of us, tribes, nonprofit organizations. Those who are willing to put extra dollars on the table to be able to advance priority resiliency work should be able to be the ones that benefit. But ideally, we would have constitutionally guaranteed state funds available as matches to federal resources. And we are trying to break through that barrier of conversation because the economic well-being in rural communities across America hinge upon us getting our work done, and we need more resources. So we're exploring those possibilities.
So, the answer to this question, well, let me see how I can say it. We'll give it back to the Indians. and I think that's the conversation. You have that conversation, the Tribal Forest Protection Act, the things that we're talking about, the current legislation that we talked about this morning. On a national level, that's the discussion. But in reality, I did want to mention, when you talk about collaboration, we always go into collaboration. I always get concerned about collaboration in my own, because when we go walk in and collaboration is about us coming together and everybody gets a piece of the pie, and that's not necessarily. That's why I've been talking about co-management, because I'm not there to try to appease somebody else. I'm there to make sure the resource values that the tribe wants protected, maintained, and enhanced are part of the conversation. And I think there is a big difference between the two. I believe we need to be, participants in collaboration, but I also think that at times collaboration becomes slow, and that slowness does not achieve the type of things that you really need. The urgency into making things happen and the planning cycles that go into these things is not effective. And what are those avenues? We need to look at what is working and the model that Indian Country has. You talk to the Forest Service, and they're more concerned about an appeal of a NEPA document than they are about their obligations and trust responsibilities to the tribes themselves. And that's a concern. That mentality, and how do we change that mentality is a fundamental place. They have us in the room. You've watched each of us work with, numerous forests that are surrounding us, and you have a lot of people that want to do things, but when you get to that place, they're concerned that they're going to have to pay $1 million to a law firm that has sued them, and that paradigm, that picture needs to change in some capacity.
Only one recommendation: cross-boundary. But it means a little more. It means coming together on priorities. It doesn't mean giving yours up. It means where do we have common objectives that are of a high enough priority that we want to mutually address those. And when that occurs, for me, it really needs to occur across the boundary. To be at a scale that makes a difference, or at least within the context of a scale that has the potential to make a difference. I think if we just look at a little piece, it doesn't quite get us there. So priority landscape and cross-boundary is the simple answer. How to make that happen within an agency like the Forest Service, who clearly has a habituation to autonomy, and 154 national forests out there, each doing their own thing, 600 ranger districts, each doing their own thing, and you will not get the same answer everywhere you go. So, and you won't get the same answer on the same ranger district for very long, because, as Gary pointed out, we move people. So it's not a simple matter, I understand that. And we're not all on the same page or up to speed in the line officer cadre of the Forest Service. So that's why I keep harping on, I just say cross-boundary. Let them figure it out. But and I told you I had $55 million to play with. Russ gave you the real number. I'm down to 33 because we spent a little extra on a few things. We spent a little extra on collaborative forest landscape restoration projects, and the chief of the Forest Service wanting to expand that. We spent a little extra getting in the position to implement large-scale projects like the Forest Restoration Initiative in Arizona. That now has 900,000 acres in a block that has made its way through the environmental clearance process with some expectations that we actually deliver on something. If we went to that much trouble to put that big a block of land through that process, and it's now approved, we better do some work, huh? And so here comes the region saying, uh-oh, we got what we asked for, now how do we implement it? And it comes down to a capacity question, so they need a little help with that capacity. And we've got some other large landscapes in the works, because we do think that's more efficient. If you get that large landscape approved, and then you can bite off projects, but you got to bite them off and you got to do them. So, and then the secretary decided he kind of liked the idea that we'd produce more volume this past year than we did the year before. And he says, hey, how about a little extra? How about hitting 3 billion board feet next year? That's only 100 million more than we did last year. And so we have stopped asking the field to do more or the same with less. And so we gave them some more to do more. And produce the extra. So yeah, we whittled that down, and we will continue to no doubt tap it for other things, but it still leaves enough for this change idea. And what I'd propose to you is you be part of that cross boundary. Try it out on your ranger district or your forest supervisor, where you might want to compare some priorities that have the right place, the right time, the right people that want to get something done in this larger context that is not just an individual ownership. And there are plenty of places, I think, in Indian country where crossing that boundary makes some sense for you. You've made the investment, you've done the work, you've managed the forest, you've reduced the risk, and you're up against some properties, a lot of times U.S. Forest Service, that haven't. And maybe some work ought to be done there. Maybe you use Tribal Forest Protection Act to help get that work done. Maybe you just sit down together and say, hey, we hear that dang deputy chief held back some of your money. We think we can help you get it back. And so I'd encourage you to go for it.
Great discussion. Briefly, anything from the audience?
Just a couple notes. This Bill Tripp from the Cutter Tribe and co-lead for Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. Last week we experienced, well, even earlier this week, we experienced quite a few lightning strikes that started fires in our planning, our 1.2 million acre planning landscape that we had selected. That it's looking like quite a few of those are contained at this point. But one thing that is concerning me is that part of implementation of the cohesive strategy is how do we change the culture of fire management to where we can use that natural ignition to our benefit. So I understand that at this point of the year, with the projected conditions for the year, why you would want to go out there and put the fire out small. But I also understand that one fire in particular that was declared contained just 2 days ago on Tin Bear Mountain is right on the edge of the 2008 fire footprint. So this would be the third interval that's been suppressed since those 2008 fires in that footprint. So we talk about. I heard someone say the other day acres restored because one fire hit the landscape. Really, it's going to take 3 to 5 fires within its natural interval to go from condition class 3 to condition class 2. And every time we remove one, we reset back to condition class 3. We don't gain any ground. So last year we had a issue, one that we'll probably face more often in the face of with climate change scenarios looking the way they are, is that by mid-June we were experiencing low flows and high water temperatures in our rivers, and the Salmon River was to the point during the spring salmon dives to where we were already at 15% mortality in our spring salmon runs in that river. The thing that was unique that we hadn't seen in previous years is that there were 800 Pacific giant salamanders dead as well. That salamander is the poof. In our culture, that's the sacred water purifier. And when something is going wrong with that species, the whole system's about to collapse. And so, luckily, I don't really want to say luckily just because of what happened last year, the July complex started, and the river temperatures went down, the flows went up, and the fish stopped dying from the smoke inversion that was created from that fire. And that's all part of this process that people don't really look at. It's sure, smoke creates impacts, but what are its benefits? And so, I know, getting back to some policy and administrative barriers here, you know, we have, it's not necessarily a barrier as it is an implementation, the culture of implementation of what we have is this fire on Tin Bear Mountain could have been declared confined, and it could have been put out and put into patrol status, and then as we hit, you know, and we could have done some rapid assessments of how far, what the extent of that interval would be, and then within that extent on that 2008 footprint, or even without, in areas that was doable, was confined by roads or reasonable control features. Why couldn't we go in stable conditions when and start burning off smaller chunks as part of the response action, and create some smoke that settles into these river corridors? If, you know, in an event, hopefully we don't have a large fire, but at least then you can juggle your priorities. If you don't have a larger priority somewhere, then you can, you know, put people in there and make sure that that interval at least is hitting a part of that landscape. I don't know how we get to that, but that's one thing that I would like to see looked at a little closer.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate the comments. Any other recommendations briefly from the crowd before we move on to the next question? Kelly?
Well, you're getting
Brian,
ready.
yeah.
I'm going to respond to that one. It is a culture of implementation, and it has to do with unevenness, inconsistency within the line officer ranks of the Forest Service. Different experiences, different levels of experience, different points in their development of their own culture. That's something I can't change much. You're going to have to deal with that. We'll deal with making line officers more aware of our intent, but they have that authority to decide what kind of suppression action to take and how aggressive to be or not be. And and they all have the risk management tools to help them make that decision. So we put some things in place, but then to get it to happen is another matter. And you just expressed a lot of knowledge about the total system that I would venture to say many of our line officers in the Forest Service don't have. And so never hesitate to help them understand with what you know. And hopefully you'll match up at some point in time and make a difference.
Moving on to the third question, I think that we've talked about collaboration earlier a lot, and we could go to what are your recommendations to foster successful collaboration, perhaps? Maybe just go there.
Okay, well, her computer's getting booted up. The Conservancy is involved in multiple collaborations across the nation. And I just want to go back to Gary's timescale. Again, if you think about generational connection and awareness of the unique subtleties of the landscape, how it functions, both biologically and culturally, those issues are critical in those conversations. Again, 63 years of history is a blink in time, but what we have found at the Nature Conservancy is that the physical treatments of our own lands and adjoining lands that are under the collaborative conversation are integral to showing the Forest Service, do you like what you see? Do you want more of it on your own land? And if so, this is what we've done. On tribal lands across America, you can demonstrate what the future, what the past has been, what the future possibility is for the federal agencies, and encouraging. It's not a matter of, again, it's getting to Jim's concept. This is not about who owns the land, it's about whose recommendations are being executed on to be able to advance the joint will of the public. Who manages the actual stewardship contracts? It's not going to be the Forest Service. They're going to let those contracts out. There are so many ways to observe what is control of the land and its outcome, but we need your voice at the table describing the present vision and the future vision and the execution of the treatments that physically are needed on the ground. And that's wealth. That's harvesting extraordinary wealth, cultural wealth, biological wealth, economic wealth, then the well-being of the communities come along with it. But we need a more active voice and a consistent voice from where I sit to be able to make the advancements we need at the scale we need. We've got to encourage the Forest Service to get from 10,000 acre treatments to treatments at the scale that Jim is incenting, like we're seeing in the 4-5 project at the million acre scales. We have to get from 3.5 million acres of physical treatment per year to at least a doubling. If we could agree upon that as an aspiration, that in the next couple of years we will get to 7 million acres and sustain that over time. We do know that from a degradation standpoint and the condition class standpoint, in terms of common language, that the Forest Service has 80 million acres that is in need of resiliency treatment. That's a lot of jobs. That's a lot of standing wealth. And they need support to be able to manage that resource. It's not a matter of who owns the land. It's who's gaining control over the treatment of that land. And we could all do that together and be proud of it.
So to answer this question, I think collaboration, can work, and that's the only way that we're going to do it. But it's definitely not an easy task to try and go through. But it does include things like relationship building, education on both parties' behalf, and some sort of, just thinking in my work with the Forest Service, some sort of sensitivity training and educating our own employees about what the federal trust responsibility is, and having everybody understand that and be very clear on that. So education, some sort of sensitivity training, starting early, obviously, and then promoting, like what a lot of folks have been saying the past couple of days, promoting those champions who can sort of serve as those liaisons and sort of walk in two worlds. Putting them in those sort of leadership roles, because they are able to sort of balance, often, very complex sides and sides that don't always agree. So I think that if we are going to try and go for collaborations, we have to really start asking the hard questions. And I was thinking about this last night, and that it really takes us having a very humble perspective and us being willing to possibly think of something different, a new solution, really challenge our own viewpoints, and go through that whole process. A story that I kind of want to share with this, just because it comes up with collaboration and, trying to work with partners where you often don't get along well or just have a tough time seeing each other's viewpoint. But I'll share a story. My mom, when my brother and I used to fight a lot as kids, her way, and my mom is Laguna, her way of getting us to actually work together, she would tie our wrists together. And then we were forced, literally forced to have to just get over it and stop beating each other up and actually get along and kind of move past that. So I think that there are traditions in our native cultures that can sort of help us, move through these collaborative processes. So that's my little story.
If they did that at my house, I think me and my brothers would still be fighting. I think an important part of a successful collaboration is actually when you go there, knowing what each participant really needs to be able to continue with what is necessary and what can be done, and really look at making those accomplishments. I think that's that's a critical component. The Yakama Nation joined the POSH Collaborative in 2007, and we haven't seen what the tribe has asked for implemented in the extent that it should, and that's our growing concern. You know, we're going to be almost 10 years into this, and hopefully this year we will see something. We'll see the positives out of that will grow, and some of this does take time to really build that capacity and that ability. But I think that's an important part. It is about relationships and respect and understanding, and understanding that those lands that we're talking about, if it's forest or the state, or those are the places where we come from. I was sitting there and I traveled with one of our leaders, and she started telling stories about the landscape, our legends, and those kind of things. And that's that connection. The history of the land is the history of who we are, and those places give us that responsibility to. And so I think we need to open up ourselves. Like I said, my reservation is closed to the public, and I don't advocate to open it. But being willing to have field trips and to showcase the activities that we do, and that goes for most of the tribes that are in this room. I think that's an important part, because people can't, until they see actually what active management on the landscape level is, and the role and the resources and what those mean to what we're talking about. I don't think they get that image. We have a University of Washington field trip that started in the early 2000s, and a professor brought his students over to the reservation. They went to the Forest Service and stopped by them first, and they went up and saw, you know, this 100-acre project, and this is new forestry and this whole concept. They came over to the reservation, and they saw on the landscape level that what they were doing on 100 acres was what we've been doing across our landscape. That has been a profound impact, and that field trip is an element into our message and the importance of that we are actually doing things on the landscape. The people that have had the opportunity to go to each of the reservations, you go down to Muscalero and you see, compare Lincoln to their lands, it's profound, and I think that's our role that we need to also do in Indian country.
So I still work in Washington, D.C., which means I don't get to tell you what collaboration is or how to do it. But in the cohesive strategy, we outlined landscapes, communities, and response. And I described earlier that if we don't work across the boundaries on those landscapes, we don't succeed, and if the community isn't involved, we don't succeed. But when I say we have to have community engagement, I don't say what engagement is. It can take a lot of different forms, and it really depends on the place and the people. And they have to decide what that means. I can say that with what we're trying to do on a landscape, has to do with priorities and crossing boundaries, land management plans, common objectives. But how you bring all that together is not something I can probably tell you. I guess you'll have to figure that out based on your own situation. I can give you intent, but I can't give you execution. All I can say is the successes that we've seen do involve some form of collaboration. It seems to be a necessary ingredient, however it gets figured out, and it's seldom figured out the same way in any two places. So if I were going to leave you with any recommendation on collaboration, it would be tie your wrists together.
Or until a decision's made or something like that.
There it is. On the collaboration, Bobby Bruno, Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs. Thank you. On the collaboration, working with the Forest Service or the BLM, a way to approach this, and one of the things that you get out of collaboration, besides the actual project that you may be working on or trying to develop in the collaboration, for tribes, the way we look at it, as an opportunity to be able to educate all those groups of who we are. And we count that as a part of the success of the collaboration is getting them to know who we are and understanding who we are and what our needs are and what we're sitting at the table. That goes a long ways because there's a lot of those groups that do not know who the tribes are and what we do and what kind of management we have and we've done over the years. So celebrate those. I think it's important and that they learn and understand who we are.
That's a good point. Especially when tribes are involved in those collaborative groups, that could be a success point, or one point of success, just to inform the members of the collaborative of who you are and what strengths you do bring to the group. Yeah. Anything else there? Okay. The next question, the climate change question. Climate change will affect the earth in many ways. How can we care for our forest in light of the drought, storms, wildfire, insect and disease, and pest infestation, species migration, invasive species, and countless other changes that we will need to face in an increasingly uncertain future?
It's my birthday. I thought you guys weren't going to ask the hard questions. This one's a hard question, but I think, you know, one thing is to create a scenario where we have options for different management actions. So I guess creating a system where there's not just, this is our one solution, where we actually have it's hard to formalize this concept, but basically just hopefully creating a system where we can have a whole array of management options. And because it is an uncertain future, we really don't know the extent of how climate is going to change our forests, our fire regimes, all these things. So I think somehow installing some sort of diversity in the system itself so that we have options is key.
So in my program, I take my advice just because of my Western bias from folks at Oregon State University, and I think about Dick Waring. Dick Waring is assisting me, who's now I think turned 80, and he's one of the great climate predictive modelers, at least in my mind, about where we're going. And he says focus on the snowpack limited systems first and work your way out from there. So when thinking about that, I then went to my second most favorite university, and that was in Washington, and I got a comment from the practical side of this. I asked Josh Lawler on the elements of what do you do with limited resources, how would you advance to have the greatest gains to the resources that we care about so deeply. And he says, well, look at the lands and waters under your management and management of the tribes, and he says what you're finding is that places where we have enabled beaver to advance in their retention of water, we're seeing some of the fastest responses to the conditions we want. We obviously have cultural challenges across America to the reintroduction of beaver, but I can tell you one thing, that as I observe the changes in the recovery and the speed of recovery, I was just down in the Klamath Basin looking at a system that was overgrazed and denuded from about the 1930s to up until the 80s. And it is, despite the drought, despite the limitations coming out of the mountains of snow, it is flowing at full bear in a braided stream condition with probably about 100 beaver within the system. It's cold, late water flows. And what's fascinating about it is that no NEPA permits were needed to build all those dams.
So we want Oregon State beavers everywhere, is that what we're saying? Okay. I represent the Yakima Nation in other forums. One of them is some water conversations in the Yakima Basin. In that conversation, you know, some of the key elements when you start talking about climate change and you look at what's really happened, this idea we grew up with what a forest looked like and what it actually was are two different stories. And so when you talk about our forest already has gone through climate change in its own right. It's the pressure that you put on there with how many trees are there, how many, starting with the grazing, the exclusion of fire, and all the obstacles, the road systems that were put there, and the species that depend upon clean water, the salmon, steelhead, you know, these bull trout, you go through these things. And so the picture really needs to go back into, is it climate change or is it the resilience that your land needs to be able to do that? Our tribe and a lot of the Columbia River Treaty tribes, we're out there implementing fisheries projects where we don't have beavers. We're actually trying to restore the floodplain by putting check structures and those kind of things. But also, the thing that we really need to talk about is it's not just that. We actually take trees and put trees down in the creeks and those kind of things. And it's a valuable tool for the thing. But we also need to put some trees on the log trucks and build that part of the economy and treat the uplands, because all the work you put down into those areas can be destroyed in a hot summer like we're already experiencing now. And so climate change is the history of the changes of land. It doesn't, if we call it climate or whatever, the land has changed. And what do we want? It's not back to some perfect, you know, 1855 when we had the treaty. It's into a place where what can be maintained across the landscape. And that's the role that we need to find. We need to challenge ourselves on the research side. We need to challenge ourselves on the active management. And I think that's the key element. And I think you get that opportunity to see those things across Indian country. And I think our values that we have on that active management, the one thing that we don't see is we don't bring the research kind of things onto the reservation. It becomes, and we don't necessarily want to either, and I will say that. I'm not, it's a lot more study instead of really, let's move on, let's turn the page and get to the next area, because usually it's a handful of folks doing it.
So I'm getting more impressed with the predictive services that we employ and what they tell us and the forecast they give us. But that's only of limited value. It's very valuable to us in our preparation for response to fire. It served us well there. In terms of land management, less so. And I think in that case, I defer to what Gary and Phil have told you. We need to anticipate the uncertainty. We need to be able to adapt to the uncertainty. And right now, I would say that's based less on knowledge and more on wisdom. And I think the tribes understand that a whole lot better than an agency understands that. So help us out.
Thank you. Any other comments from the audience? Dave still back there? Colin.
Thanks. Surprisingly, I don't have a comment. I have a bit of a question. I missed Bob Harrington here to represent the state foresters and NASF. Some of you may not miss him because he's got strong opinions, but I appreciate that he does have strong opinions, and I haven't heard a response or a comment with respect to any of these, but in particular climate change and how we intend to be responsive. You used to be one, Jim, or somebody else might be able to speak on behalf of the state foresters on this and the other questions. This being the climate change one and how we can respond and be adaptive. But in general, if we could bring in the states, we've talked about all the other governments, but not the states yet.
So when I was a state forester, I loved talking for all the other state foresters, and you guys know how that works. The state forestry agencies are not any different than the rest of us in terms of observing what climate differences are making to how we manage the land and what considerations we should take into account for future management of the land. They're in the same boat. Politically, some of them can say climate change, some of them can't. That's part of the game, but in terms of what we do, how we do it, the way we manage land, the way we think about the future of managing land, whether it's response to disasters, response to fire and insect disease, response or just anticipating what kind of genetics we need to be concerned about, or high elevation species we need to be concerned about. They've got all the same questions, same issues that the rest of us do, and they don't have it any more figured out than the rest of us.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. What role do you see fire playing within the various land management schemes? Suppression versus management of fire?
Ask and answer.
It seems like if we're going with the suppression paradigm for fire management, then we have to accept that we are also then sort of promoting type conversions and going from where I'm familiar in the Southwest, going from ponderosa pine forest to more of a pinyon juniper forest, because when we have a fire in our ponderosa pine, it's seeming more and more that those are now being converted over to pinyon juniper stands. So it's a complete type conversion or shift in species composition. So if we are going with the suppression fire policy, we have to accept that that's possibly a consequence. If we're more going towards the fire use, fire management paradigm, I think that the consequence of that is, more so promoting a natural disturbance regime and restoring those processes. So, if I were to vote on which one, I do hope that we can restore those natural processes. So, more so with the fire use policy.
So as I looked at this question, I had to stop and reflect upon the evolution of our thinking across America about the use of fire, and I think about the role of the Forest Service in the conversation and the establishment of a fire learning network and how that has grown across America and how that has changed the conversation, and then how we now have evolved into the fire adapted community conversation, and how that is going to help the unified efforts of those two major efforts to really reduce the cost of fighting fire. And if we target on the wildland-urban interface and the at-risk geographies there, and to keep the cost down associated with those, and to increase the knowledge and awareness of what people have to do in their own homes in those geographies, we're just going to, it is my hope that we will see more resources being able to be put into the proactive use of fire. And I just want to acknowledge Jim for his consistent advocacy for those two programs and the role of the resources, and to really leverage the change in that shifting culture. But at the same time, we really need to make sure that there is a growing level of people with the experience and the utilization of fire on the ground, that the universities keep advancing the education around it, the careers that are going to be able to be built, and the stability as we try to address the broad landscape across America. We have to continue to put fires out, but if we are to acknowledge the health and well-being of the forest, we've got to then come back in the shoulder seasons and bring fire right back into the systems, and we have to get communities very comfortable with it. We have a united responsibility to make sure that we are comfortable with smoke and fire in our surroundings, and there are, again, a lot of jobs that are going to be created in that process.
I think a key element is it's in space and time, and that's the key element. Where you can use the tools, and it's the tools in the toolbox, and using the tools when they're available. And there are times that I do think that the use of fire is going to be a big part of the toolbox. But right now, I think the concern is if there is a fire, the resource damages that they can cause, but without the reduction of fields, reducing the stocking levels and creating the type of landscape that will carry a fire from being a couple acres into tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. I think that's the real question, and what kind of, how do you react to those things? And so ultimately, I think the goal is to have this use of fire, but on the same time, I also think the goal also, what are we trying to achieve out of our forest, and what are those components to achieve those things? And those goals need to be part of an overall plan, looking at what you are trying to get to, and the use of, and you need all the tools in the toolbox, the chainsaws and the torches, and this is the conversation I think is important.
This is another one that's really difficult for an agency like the Forest Service, and it gets back to that inconsistency in our line officers and different skills and different understandings. So if you're talking about suppression, mandates come into play, and the land management agency like the Forest Service or the BLM has a different mandate for fire suppression than a state or a local department. Those states and locals have a mandate to put the thing out and put it out as quick as you can. Federal agencies have a little more latitude than that, and they have ground where it makes sense to put fire back in the equation. That makes everybody nervous. If that isn't a unified decision, that causes all kinds of trouble, because if you're managing a fire in the backcountry, you're probably bargaining on a long duration event beyond what you can predict will happen with the weather. You can update that, but once it gets big, it's big. And the wrong weather comes along, it can spread and cause you all kinds of trouble that you didn't anticipate in the beginning. So you have to be together on that kind of a decision, and we're getting better at it. But a lot of those line officers aren't willing to take that risk and manage it in that way and have something go wrong later and cost them their career. So it's going to be uneven again, but the policy isn't. The policy is to assess those values and risk and manage accordingly, knowing that fire needs to be part of the equation. And it remains, whether we want it to or not, our major land treatment tool. If you're talking about prescribed fire, then it has to increase, no question about it. But it only takes a few of them going wrong, and it sets you back quite a ways. One went wrong in the state of Colorado and there were fatalities. The governor of the state banned fire. It's banned still on the Front Range of the state, prescribed fire. And asked the Forest Service to do a report that said, and they wanted the report to say that prescribed fire in the wildland urban interface is too risky, we're going to eliminate it. That's not what the report said. The report said essentially you can't cut your way out of this problem. You've got to put fire in the equation sooner or later. And if you don't, nature will. So there's a lot of complexities on fire. But the fact that we need more fire in the system is for sure, and that we need to increase our use of prescribed fire is for sure. But making that happen is a little more difficult.
Thank you very much. And that, Tony Jack.
Tony Howard with the Confederated Sedition Kootenai Tribe. Got enough years under my belt to think back into the early 70s and how it was to be a fire manager or how to manage fire with less complexities, I think, at that time. And you know, there didn't seem to be quite as many issues and quite as many contentions at that point. But we all have to agree that it sure has changed. And you know, it's an important factor, and I think a lot of tribes are really rolling towards that appropriate management more strongly on the lands that they can return or reintroduce fire. And in realizing that you know, treatments, active treatments, mechanical harvesting, and especially with prescribed fire follow-ups and getting fire in the land is important, but we all believe though that you can't do it with just prescribed fire alone. That we're going to have to get better and taking care of the risks. We're going to have to be better leaders, and we are going to get into situations whether we want to be there or not of managing long-term fire, and where we're going to have to share fire across boundaries, Jim. Come back to that subject again. But I guess my thoughts, though, I'm like Colin, where I really am missing having Bob Harrington here, because there was several years, or at least 10 years ago, where we had a fire year where there were a lot of fires in the Northern Rockies in wilderness that were being managed for resource benefit. And it went on, and it got drier and drier. And like we all kind of figured there at some point along the line that those early decisions ended up with a transfer of risk from public lands and management of fire for multiple benefits. And it came out, and the state and private folks and the county folks all had to deal with it. And it really brought it to a point, because the states are like tribes where they have a trust responsibility, whether it's school trust lands or whether it's a trust responsibility to the tribal members and the collective community. But I guess with the cohesive strategy, we said that I guess some of the slogans are that you want to fight fire when needed and encourage fire where you can. And that's kind of an overriding strategy, I think, as we move forward. But also as part of that slogan is how we can get better at living with fire. So I guess a question, I'd be curious if you have any thoughts or comments on being better partners in sharing risk, in sharing cross boundary fires, whether it's wanted fire or unwanted fire, and transfer issues that are a big concern between agencies.
So I will take a stab at a state forester's perspective in Oregon through an example. Under the leadership of the previous Oregon governor and an approach and a true belief in an all lands approach, Doug Decker encouraged his staff at the Board of Forestry to aggressively, as soon as the major fire events of the year were out, to turn around and help and do prescribed fire wherever possible with partners across lines, whether it was BLM lands, Forest Service lands, Nature Conservancy lands, or others. If you had a prescription that it was a priority for treatment, their staff would be there and they would take the responsibility and actually light the fire for the team. So just, again, different state, different relationship.
That one's too easy. Montana and Wyoming aren't as easy. So whether you call it collaboration, co-management, shared decision-making, whatever it is, that's necessary in this kind of business, because long-duration events aren't as predictable as you would like. And that's what you get into when you let something go. Prescribed fire in difficult situations sometimes goes wrong. So all of that has to occur. People have to be together in making that decision and together in assessing the risk and deciding what they're comfortable living with, and you have to respect that. And you have to do it early. My direction to Forest Service line officers is, if you're going to make a decision about a long duration event in the wilderness, you don't get to make that by yourself. It may be 20 miles from the boundary, you still don't get to make that by yourself, because it could go wrong, and so others have to be involved with you that have some responsibility and or could have responsibility as this evolves. So we need it. We need both. We need more fire on the land, one way or the other, and we have to make that decision together.
Before we close the panel, and I really appreciate the discussion and the participation by our panel members. Before we close the panel and before we break, we'd like to have Gary just offer some closing comments.
Thank you, Jim. I wanted to return to one of the slides in my presentation, which is basically what, why, and how. We've talked a little bit about the what. The vision. One of the things about visions is that lots of people have them. And one of the wondrous things about forestry is that forests mean lots of different things to different people in different ways. One of the challenges that we have to deal with is to look for commonalities and not differences. And I think that we have to avoid the temptation for over-analysis and just learn how to talk to one another. We need to find that common ground in order to move forward. Secondly, the why. As I mentioned, forests mean a lot of different things, but we have to learn how to communicate. And our message is what we have to decide upon. We've got to decide, what is it that we want to convey? What is it we want to communicate? And we have to be able to counter misinformation, misunderstanding, and intentional misrepresentation. And there's a lot of that out there. There are people that seem to want to benefit from confusion and controversy. And the only way that we're going to be able to counter that is if we have a unified way of conveying what it is we want to accomplish, what's at stake, what are the risks and values that we care about, and what is it that we think we can do about it. And that's where the how comes in, that we all have the need and the recognition that we have to actively manage the land. The problem is that we have to find a way of integrating the skills, the knowledge, the expertise and the influence that each of us can bring to bear in this problem. We have to find a way of doing things bigger, better, faster, as Jim has mentioned earlier yesterday, and we've got to do so efficiently and effectively. And I hope that the case studies that we find or that we're going to hear in the next panel will help us gain some insight as to how we can accomplish that.
Thank you very much. And would you help me, find